I found someone who truly makes me happy, and I will not give that up. Everyone left me, my wife, my son, my daughter. I walked out of the house without looking back and without a single tear. But what happened next will make you applaud. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. I found someone who makes me truly happy, and I'm not going to give that up. That was the last thing I heard before everything collapsed. It wasn't a stranger who told me that. It wasn't someone off the street. It was Aurora, my wife, the woman I slept in the same bed with for 25 years. The woman for whom I worked every day of my life without complaining. And the worst part, what I still struggle to say out loud today, is that she wasn't alone when she said it. Jonathan, my son, and Julieta, my daughter, were there. The three of them together, looking at me as if I were the problem. They all abandoned me, my wife, my son, my daughter. And I left that house without looking back, without tears, without pleas, with a suitcase in my hand and my head held high. But what happened next, what came after that moment, that's what I need to tell you, because if you stay until the end of this story, you'll understand why today, for the first time in many years, I can say that I'm a free man. And you'll also understand why those who betrayed me ended up facing something none of them expected. Stay, because this story begins with a betrayal, but it doesn't end as a defeat. That afternoon, I was coming home from work, 49 years old, my back heavy with exhaustion, my feet heavy as if they were carrying everything I had built in these decades. I walked in through the front door, as always, with the key I myself had paid for, in the house I myself had built sacrifice by sacrifice. And the first thing I saw was the three of them together, Aurora, Jonathan, Julieta, sitting in the living room in silence, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just interrupted something important. The TV wasn't on. There was no food in the kitchen, just the three of them with faces I had never seen on them before, faces that had already made a decision without consulting me. Aurora was the first to speak, and she did so with a calm that chilled my blood. She told me they had been thinking about this for weeks, that they had reached a conclusion, and then she said it. She told me she didn't want to be married to me anymore, that she had fallen in love with someone else, that this person was someone I knew, someone who had been in my house, someone who had eaten at my table. The floor moved under my feet, or at least that's what it felt like. A kind of internal tremor that has no name in any language, but that anyone who has been truly betrayed recognizes immediately. It's not pain yet. It's something before the pain. It's the exact moment when the brain receives the information, but the heart still refuses to process it. I looked at Jonathan, my son, the same one I had taught to ride a bike, the one I had accompanied on his first day of school, the one I had supported financially even when things were tough. I looked at him hoping he would defend me, that he would at least show some sign of discomfort. But no, Jonathan crossed his arms and told me with a coldness I still find hard to believe that he thought his mother was right, that I had never really been present, that I had always prioritized work over family, that if his mother was happy with someone else, he supported her. I felt the ground disappear completely. I turned to Julieta, my daughter, the girl I had held in my arms when she had a fever, the one who had cried on my shoulder when her first boyfriend left her, the one who always told me I was her example. Julieta didn't look me in the eyes. She looked at the floor, and in a low voice, almost a whisper, she said that she had also known for a long time, that she had kept the secret because she didn't know how to tell me, that she hoped I could understand. Understand. 25 years of marriage. 25 years of getting up before everyone else to go to work. 25 years of paying bills, fixing what was broken, sacrificing my own dreams so they could have everything they needed. And now they were asking me to understand, as if understanding were something you could just ask for like that. Head on, in the living room of the house I had built, surrounded by the three people I had trusted most in my entire life, there was a long, very long silence. And in that silence, something inside me changed. It didn't explode. It didn't scream. It didn't break anything. It simply changed. Like when a key turns in a lock and the mechanism clicks. A small, almost imperceptible, but definitive sound. I looked at the three of them one by one. First Aurora, then Jonathan, then Julieta, and I said nothing for what seemed like several minutes. They were waiting for a reaction. They were expecting me to cry or scream or beg or collapse right there on the floor of that living room. But I did none of that. I got up slowly, went to the bedroom, took a suitcase from the closet, the same suitcase I had used on our honeymoon, and began to fold clothes with a calm I didn't even understand myself at that moment. Shirts, pants, important documents, the photos that were only mine, my things, only my things. Aurora appeared at the bedroom door and asked me what I was doing. I told her I was leaving. She told me I didn't have to leave that night, that we could talk, that we could resolve it in a civilized manner. I replied that there was nothing left to talk about, that everything they had to tell me they had already told me. And then I told her something I had been holding back without knowing it for years. I told her that never, at any point in my life, had I imagined that the three people I loved most in the world would be capable of sitting down together to plan my destruction. I didn't say it with anger. I said it with a cold clarity that surprised even me. I closed the suitcase, took it with my right hand, walked down the hallway, passed by the living room where Jonathan and Julieta were still sitting without moving. I didn't look at them. I didn't say goodbye. I opened the front door, went out, and closed it behind me, without looking back, without tears, with a broken heart, but with my head held high. And standing on that sidewalk, in front of the house that had been mine for a quarter of a century, with a suitcase in my hand and the whole world crumbling around me, I made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I was going to be the man who rebuilds. But before I tell you what came next, you need to understand who I was before that day. Because no one betrays someone without a reason. And the reason they use to justify themselves, when you hear it, you'll understand exactly why what happened to them afterwards was exactly what they deserved. To understand what happened next, you need to know who I was before that night. Not the man who left with a suitcase, not the man who closed the door without looking back. The man who had reached that point, the man who had built everything from scratch and who, without knowing it, had also been building his own trap. I was born into a family with no money. I don't say that to evoke pity. I say it because it's important for you to understand. My father worked in construction and my mother cleaned other people's houses. From the age of 14, I was already helping to pay the household bills. There was no long childhood, no carefree adolescence. There was work, responsibility, and the conviction that if I didn't move, no one was going to move for me. That idea was etched so deeply in me that it became my way of existing, to work, to provide, to support. That was what I knew how to do. That was what I believed it meant to love someone. I met Aurora when I was 23. She was 21. She was pretty, cheerful, full of life. She looked at me as if I were something special. And for a man who had grown up feeling invisible, that look was worth more than anything else in the world. We got married 2 years later. We had almost nothing. We rented a small room, shared a single old car, and I worked double shifts so we could save something. Aurora worked too at the beginning, but when Jonathan came along, we decided together that she would stay at home. It was a decision we both made, or at least that's what I thought. Jonathan was born when I was 26. Julieta arrived 3 years later, and with each child that came, I felt the responsibility multiply, but also the determination, because it was no longer just for me. It was for them, for that boy who looked at me with wide eyes, for that girl who fell asleep in my arms, for Aurora, who told me I was the best man she had ever met. Do you know what that does to a man who grew up feeling invisible? It turns him into a machine for producing, for solving, for supporting. And I became exactly that. I got up early every morning for 25 years. I worked at whatever was necessary. I changed jobs when something better came along. I learned new things when the market demanded it. I came to earn well, not extraordinarily, but enough to give them their own house, a decent car, a vacation once a year, an education for my children without them having to worry about anything. But there was a price I paid without realizing it, and that price is called presence. I wasn't at many birthdays. I didn't go to all the school plays. I didn't listen to enough conversations at dinner because I came home too late or too tired. I thought providing was enough. I thought the money I left on the table every month was the most concrete way to tell my family I love them. No one told me I was wrong, or if someone did, I didn't know how to listen. Because when you spend your whole life being the person who holds everything up, you don't know how to stop. You don't know how to let go of the weight without feeling like you're failing. And Aurora knew that. She knew that part of me better than anyone. She knew that if I told her something was bothering her, I would solve it with money or with work. She knew that I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to give her what she perhaps needed. And instead of talking to me, instead of sitting in front of me and telling me honestly that something was wrong in our marriage, she chose another path. She chose another man. I don't know exactly when it started, but I do know because I later found out details I'd rather not know that she had been in that relationship for over a year before she told me. A whole year, 365 days in which I continued to go to work, continued to pay the mortgage, continued to believe that my family was fine while in my own house, a lie the size of a building was being constructed. And what hurt me the most wasn't the infidelity itself. What hurt me the most was discovering that my children knew. Jonathan had known for several months. Qley for almost a year. Both had kept that secret. Both had looked me in the eyes every time I came home, every time I sat at the table with them, every time I asked them how they were, and they had answered normally. As if nothing was wrong, as if I didn't deserve the truth, as if protecting their mother was more important than respecting their father. That's what hurts the most about a family betrayal. It's not the initial blow. It's the accumulation of small lies that came before. It's realizing that while you thought you were inside something, you'd been left outside for a long time. The night I left the house with that suitcase, I got in my car and drove aimlessly for almost an hour. I wasn't crying, I couldn't. It was as if my body had disconnected from my emotions to protect me from the full impact. I drove through streets I knew by heart. I passed places Aurora and I had visited together. And everything felt at once familiar and completely alien, as if it were someone else's city, as if my life had been someone else's and I had just woken up in the middle of it without knowing how I got there. I stopped in an empty parking lot. I turned off the engine, and there, alone in the darkness of that car, was the first time I felt the real weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry yet, but I felt something I don't know if it has a name. A kind of huge, cold emptiness that fills your entire chest and makes you feel that breathing requires a conscious effort, that if you stop thinking about breathing, you simply stop doing it. I took out my phone, looked at my contacts, and realized something that hit me almost as hard as the betrayal itself. I didn't know who to call. 25 years building a life for my family, and I had no one to call in the most difficult moment of my existence. Friends had fallen by the wayside. Outings, plans, conversations, everything had been sacrificed on the altar of family responsibility. I had given so much of myself inside that house that outside there was almost nothing left, almost nothing. But not nothing. There was a name on my phone that I hesitated to dial. Hector, a childhood friend with whom I had lost contact years ago, but who occasionally sent me a message to see how I was. I always left it for later. I was always busy. There was always something more urgent. But that night, in that dark parking lot, with a suitcase on the back seat and my entire life in pieces, I dialed his number without thinking too much. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting. I said only 3 words, "I need help." And he said, "Tell me where you are." That was all. No questions, no judgments, no the speech I didn't need to hear at that moment. Just those 5 words that at that moment were the most important words anyone had said to me in a long time. I drove to his house. It was almost 11 at night. Hector opened the door in his pajamas, looked at my face, and without saying a word, let me in, put a glass of water in my hand, and sat across from me in silence, waiting, without rushing, without the weight of expectations. And there, for the first time since I had closed that door, I let something out. I didn't cry yet, but I spoke. I told him everything, every word Aurora had said, every second of Jonathan's silence. Every moment Julieta had looked at the floor and Hector listened to everything without interrupting me once. When I finished, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Ezekiel, the man who built all that from scratch, can build something new. What was lost tonight wasn't you. It's just a version of you that no longer serves you." I didn't fully understand it that night, but I kept it. I kept it in the only place no one had been able to touch yet. I slept on Hector's couch that first night and the next 4 as well. It wasn't a comfortable couch. It was one of those old pieces of furniture that had been through too many moves and had a spring in the middle that dug into your back if you didn't position yourself at exactly the right angle. But I slept well. or at least better than I would have expected. Maybe because the body, when it's truly exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long, finds rest even in the most uncomfortable places. Or maybe because for the first time in a long time, there was no one beside me who was lying to me. The first few days were strange. Not in a dramatic way. Not like in the movies where the protagonist cries looking out the window with sad music in the background. It was a quieter, more everyday strangeness. I would wake up, and for the first few seconds, before my memory fully kicked in, everything was fine, and then the memory would come, not like a blow, more like a slow, constant, inevitable tide. And then I had to decide again every morning whether I was going to let myself sink or whether I was going to stand up. I chose to stand up, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was not an option for me. Hector had been living alone for 3 years. He had also divorced, although under very different circumstances than mine, and he had learned to build a small but orderly life for himself. He had his routine, his work, his spaces, and without making a drama of it, he integrated me into that routine with a naturalness that I appreciated more than I was able to express at the time. He let me use the kitchen. He let me a change of clothes while I organized my things. He invited me to walk with him in the mornings, something he did every day and that I had never done in my adult life because there was always something more urgent to attend to. Those morning walks were, without exaggeration, one of the things that helped me the most in those first few weeks. There was something about the simple act of walking without a mandatory destination, without a clock marking the time, without anyone expecting anything from me, that began to loosen something I had held very tightly inside. We walked in silence most of the time. Hector wasn't one to fill the silence with unnecessary words. And I, who had been surrounded by noise and obligations my whole life, discovered that silence wasn't empty. It was space, a space I had never given myself permission to occupy. But the world doesn't stop because your life has fallen apart. The bills don't wait, the commitments don't disappear, and I had practical matters to resolve with an urgency I couldn't ignore. The first and most immediate was money. I was still working, thank God, and my salary was still coming in. But the bank account I had shared with Aurora for 25 years was a complicated territory. There were savings, there were small investments we had made together, there were also debts. The mortgage on the house mainly, which still had several years to go. None of that was going to resolve itself. And I knew that if I didn't act fast, I could lose more than I had already lost. I called a lawyer I didn't have one I trusted, so Hector recommended someone who had handled his own divorce, a direct, no-nonsense man who explained to me clearly what my legal situation was and what options I had. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours, and at the end of it my head was full of legal terms, and my stomach was full of a cold anxiety that sets in when you realize that a life built over decades can be reduced to a series of documents, figures, and negotiations. But I also came out of that meeting with something important, clarity. I knew what to expect. I knew what my rights were, and I knew that although the process was going to be difficult, I wasn't in as vulnerable a position as Aurora. I probably expected to be because, yes, I think about it now, and I thought about it. Then, Aurora was counting on me to break down. She was counting on the pain to paralyze me enough for her to handle the terms of the separation in her favor. I had seen that tactic before in divorces of acquaintances, and I recognized the pattern. The sudden confession, the united front with the children, the emotional pressure for me to make hasty decisions at a moment of maximum vulnerability. It didn't work because I didn't break down, I left, and that difference changed everything. The second week away from home was when I started to feel the real blow. Not the emotional blow of betrayal, but the physical blow of absence. I miss stupid things. The sound of the coffee maker in the morning, the smell of the house, the way the light came through the bedroom window at a certain time in the afternoon, things you don't know you love until you no longer have them. And with those things came the memories too. Good memories, real moments of happiness we had lived together, Aurora and I, before something between us faded, without either of us knowing exactly when it had started to fade. That's the cruelest thing about a long betrayal. It doesn't erase the good moments, it contaminates them. It leaves them there intact in the memory, but with a shadow over them that changes their meaning. And you're left not knowing what to do with them, whether to keep them, whether to throw them away, whether to simply learn to look at them from a distance like relics of a version of life that no longer exists. There was one night, the 10th or 11th since I left, when I finally cried. It wasn't a dramatic cry. It was silent. I was sitting on Hector's couch with the TV on some channel I wasn't watching, and suddenly my chest tightened in a way I could no longer control. I cried for Aurora. I cried for the years. I cried for Jonathan and Julieta, not with anger, but with a deep sadness for the relationship we had had, and that would never be the same again. I cried for the man I had been, the one who had worked so hard and rested so little, the one who had believed that love was demonstrated with effort and not with presence. I cried for a long hour, and when I finished I felt different, not cured, not completely relieved, but lighter, as if I had needed to release exactly that to be able to keep walking. Hector never mentioned that night. The next morning we went for a walk as usual, had coffee as usual, and he continued to be the same quiet man who didn't need to turn every difficult moment into a conversation about feelings. And I thanked him in silence, the way men sometimes thank for the most important things, without words, but with all the certainty in the world. It was during that third week that Hector told me about an opportunity. He worked at a medium-sized logistics and distribution company, and he knew they were looking for someone for a supervisory position in a branch they had just opened in another part of the city. It wasn't a glamorous job. It didn't pay what I was earning at the time, but it had something my current job no longer had for me. Distance. Distance from everything that reminded me of a life I had just lost. A new office, new faces, new routines. A place where no one would look at me with pity or with that discomfort people have when they don't know what to say to someone who is just separated. I told him I would think about it, but deep down I already knew the answer because something in me had begun to understand that rebuilding a life doesn't mean recovering what was lost. It means having the courage to build something completely different, something that's truly yours. Not of the version of you that existed for others, of the version you don't know yet, but that's there waiting on the other side of all that pain. I didn't see it clearly yet, but I felt it. And sometimes feeling it is enough to take the next step. I accepted the job. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right decision. And sometimes life puts in front of you exactly what you need at the moment you least expect it. Not wrapped in a bow or with a clear explanation, but simply there available, waiting for you to have enough courage to take it. I talked to Hector that same night. I told him yes, that I wanted to meet the people at the company, that I wanted to know more about the position, that I was willing to start at a lower level if it meant a new beginning in a place where no one knew me as the man whose family had betrayed him. Hector smiled in a way that wasn't celebratory, but of relief, as if he'd been waiting for that answer and hadn't wanted to pressure me to get to it on my own. The interview was a week later. I put on the most presentable clothes I had in that suitcase I had packed so calmly that night. I looked at myself in a mirror in Hector's bathroom and saw a man who looked more tired than I remembered, but also more honest, without the burden of pretending everything was fine, without the mask you put on when you live a lie without knowing it. Just me, 49 years old, a life in pieces and the determination not to stay among the rubble. The interview lasted 40 minutes. The human resources manager was a young man, much younger than me, but he knew how to listen. I told him about my experience, about the years I had been working in the sector, about the responsibilities I'd handled. I didn't tell him about my personal life, of course, but I think something in my way of speaking, in the direct and unadorned way I answered each question, gave him the impression that I was someone who no longer had time to waste on beating around the bush. They called me 3 days later to tell me the job was mine. That night, Hector opened a bottle of wine he kept for special occasions, and we toasted in the small kitchen of his apartment, without speeches, without exaggerated celebrations. Just two men who had lived enough to know that true beginnings don't come with fanfare. They come in silence, almost without you noticing, like the dawn that doesn't ask permission to appear. I started work the following Monday. The first day was exactly what I needed and exactly what I feared at the same time. No one knew me. No one knew anything about me beyond what my resume said. No one looked at me, with that mix of compassion and discomfort I had started to detect in the eyes of the people in my previous job. Those people who had somehow found out what had happened and didn't know how to behave with me. Here I was simply Ezekiel, the new supervisor, the man who arrived on time, who did his job without complaints, and who had his coffee alone in silence during the morning break. There was something liberating about being a stranger. My entire adult life had been defined by my roles. Aurora's husband, Jonathan, and Julietta's father, the responsible man, the provider, the one who never failed. And now for the first time, I was simply me, with no known history, no inherited expectations, without the weight of an identity built for others. The first few weeks at the new job were intense, but good. The team was small, about 12 people, and there was a dynamic that took me a while to read, but once I understood it, it was manageable. There were normal tensions of any work environment, small personality conflicts, different ways of doing things, but nothing that couldn't be handled with patience and the experience that comes with age. I focused on work with an intensity that surprised even my new colleagues. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I needed something concrete to put the energy into that otherwise would have turned into rumination, into circular thoughts, into the kind of dark brooding that destroys men from the inside when they have nowhere to direct their strength. The work was my anchor during those months, and at the same time, for the first time in my life, it wasn't just work because Hector had taught me something with those morning walks that I hadn't known how to give myself in decades, the value of my own time. I started walking alone too, not always with Hector, but sometimes on my own in the afternoons after work, along routes I was discovering without haste. I found a park 20 minutes from the company that had a bench in front of a small artificial lake, and I sat there several afternoons in a row doing nothing but looking at the water and letting the thoughts pass without clinging to them. It sounded trivial, but for a man who had spent 25 years without ever stopping, learning to sit without guilt was almost a revolutionary act. It was in that park that I met Estefania. It wasn't a cinematic encounter. There were no glances exchanged across a lighted room, no background music, none of those moments the cinema has taught us to expect when something important is about to happen. It was much simpler than that. She was sitting on the same bench I used to occupy reading a book, and I arrived without realizing someone was already there. I apologized. I was on the look for another place, and she looked up from the book and told me there was enough space for both of us. We sat in silence for a long time. She continued reading. I continued looking at the water, and then, without either of us planning it, we started talking. I don't remember exactly what the first conversation was about. I think it started with something unimportant. The weather, the park, some casual comment about the city. But there was something in the way Estefania spoke that I found different from anything I had known in a long time. She was direct without being blunt. She was curious without being invasive. She asked questions with a genuine interest that she didn't try to hide, but also didn't demand answers. And she had a way of listening with her eyes on you, with her body oriented towards the conversation that made you feel that what you were saying really mattered. We talked for almost an hour that first day. When she got up to leave, she told me her name. I told her mine, and that was it. There was no exchange of numbers that first time. There was no gesture laden with intention. Just two people who had sat on the same bench and had discovered that it was nice to talk to someone who didn't know you from before. I went back to the park the next day, and the next, at the same time, to the same bench. I'm telling the truth when I say I didn't go looking for her consciously, but I wouldn't have been bothered to find her either. And on the third day, she was there again. That second conversation was longer, and the third, even longer. Little by little, without forcing anything, I got to know some of her story. Estefania was 44. She had had her own difficult chapter a few years back, a long relationship that ended in ways that had forced her to relearn who she was when she stopped being half of someone else. She knew what it was to rebuild herself. She had done it. And when I, cautiously and without going into painful details, told her something of what I had been through in recent months, she didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with recognition. That's what hit me the hardest, not the compassion, the recognition. Because there's a huge difference between someone who looks at you and thinks, poor thing, and someone who looks at you and thinks, I've been there too. Pity makes you small, Recognition makes you equal. And I, who had spent months feeling diminished by what my family had done to me, needed someone to see me as an equal more than I could have expressed in words. I didn't fall in love with Estefania overnight. It wasn't like that. It was something much more gradual, more honest, more built on real conversations and shared silences than on impulses or needs to fill a void. We started seeing each other more often, first in the park, then having coffee in a nearby place, then walking through different parts of the city that neither of us had fully explored. And at some point in that process, without there being an exact moment I could point to on a calendar, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I felt good. Not good in the sense that everything was resolved or that the pain had completely disappeared, but good in the simplest and most powerful sense of the word. Good when I walked, good when I talked, good when I laughed at something she said, good when I came home, which was no longer Hector's couch, but a small apartment I had rented a few weeks ago. And I thought about the day's conversation and smiled without anyone watching me. The kind of good that no one can give you if you haven't first built it from the inside. And while I was building that, while I was slowly learning to be a version of myself that didn't exist to support anyone, but simply to live back in the house I had left behind, things were starting to move in a way I didn't know yet. But I would soon find out. I had been out of that house for almost 4 months when I received the first message from Julieta. It wasn't a long message. It wasn't an elaborate apology or a detailed explanation of everything that had happened. It was just a few lines saying she wanted to know how I was, that she was thinking of me, that she hoped I was well. I read it 3 times and then turned the screen off and placed the phone face down on the table. I didn't reply that day or the next, not because I wanted to punish her or because I was building a strategy of silence to make her feel bad, but because I genuinely needed time to decide what I felt before deciding what to say. Because I had learned in those 4 months of solitude and reconstruction that reacting quickly from pain almost never leads to anything good, and that sometimes the smartest answer is simply not to answer until you can do it from a place that isn't the open wound. I replied 3 days later. With few words too, I told her I was fine, that I appreciated her asking, and that when she was ready to have a real conversation, I would be willing to listen. Julieta took 2 more weeks to write again. That second time it was different. She wrote me a long message, one of those that you can tell someone has rewritten several times before sending, because every word is chosen with care. She told me she was sorry, that she knew what she had done keeping that secret for so long had been a betrayal as big as her mother's, although of a different nature. That she didn't have a valid excuse, only the explanation that she had been afraid. Afraid of losing her mother if she spoke, afraid of destroying the family if she told the truth, afraid, deep down, of facing a situation that no child should have to face. I read it slowly, very slowly, and something in me moved. It didn't resolve, the pain didn't disappear, but it moved because underneath all the anger I still carried toward her, there was something older and deeper, which was a father's love. And that love doesn't disappear because someone fails you. It gets complicated, it gets filled with layers, but it doesn't disappear. I replied with honesty. I told her I loved her, that that wasn't in question, but that the damage they had done to me, her included, was real and that it would take time to process, that I couldn't promise her that everything would go back to the way it was, because the way it was had ceased to exist, but that if she wanted to build something different, something more honest, I was willing to try little by little. It was the most adult conversation we had had in years. With Jonathan, it was different, completely different. Jonathan didn't write to apologize. Jonathan called me on a Tuesday afternoon with an energy I recognized immediately because I had heard it his whole life. It was the energy of someone who wants something, not someone who comes to give, but someone who comes to ask. And before he had said more than 3 sentences, I already knew that call wasn't about repairing anything between us. He told me that Aurora had made decisions about the house, that she had been talking to lawyers, that there were things at stake that also affected the children, and that he thought I should know. And between the lines, with that ability some people have to ask without directly saying they're asking, he was suggesting that if I acted in a certain way in the legal process, if I gave in on certain points, if I didn't fight too much, things could be resolved more peacefully for everyone. For everyone. He said that phrase to me twice. I listened to everything without interrupting him, and when he finished, I asked him a single question. I asked him if he had called to apologize for what he had said to me that night in the living room, or if he had called because he needed something from me in this legal process. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to give me the answer without needing words. Then he told me that the two things weren't mutually exclusive. I told him he was right, that the two things could coexist, but that I was going to deal with each one separately and in the right order. First the personal, then the practical. And that if he wanted to talk about the personal, really, without an agenda, I was available. But that if what he wanted was to negotiate legal terms using the father-son relationship as a bargaining chip, that wasn't going to work, that for that he had a lawyer, and that the two lawyers could talk to each other. Jonathan hung up without saying goodbye. I wasn't surprised, and it didn't hurt as much as I would have expected, because there was something these months had taught me with brutal clarity. When you stop needing the approval of the people who hurt you, you also stop being afraid of them, and without that fear, difficult conversations become manageable. Not easy, but manageable. With Aurora, there were no direct calls or messages during those first months. Everything went through the lawyers, which is exactly how it should have been, but I got news of her through indirect channels from mutual acquaintances, from things Julieta mentioned unintentionally in some conversation, and what I got painted a picture that didn't exactly make me happy, because I'm not a man who enjoys the suffering of others. But it did confirm something I had begun to suspect from the beginning. Aurora's relationship with that other man wasn't going well. Apparently, the version of that person Aurora had known during the secret romance was quite different from the version that appeared when the relationship became official and daily. That happens. It happens more than people admit. When a relationship is born in secrecy, in the thrill of the forbidden, in stolen encounters and sustained lies, it has an artificial intensity that doesn't survive contact with reality, with bills, with ordinary days, with small disagreements that accumulate, with the absence of the adrenaline that previously made everything seem special. But that was Aurora's problem, not mine. My problem, or rather, my occupation, was something completely different. Because while all that was happening, while the lawyers exchanged documents and Jonathan processed his own wounded pride and Julieta tried to rebuild something with me from honesty, I was building something I had never had in my adult life. I was building a life that was mine. The apartment I had rented was small, much smaller than a house. 1 bedroom, a living room that also served as a dining room, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom that had the shower too close to the sink. It wasn't what I had had, but it was mine, only mine. And I started putting things in it with a deliberate slowness, without haste, choosing each object, not because it completed a space, but because I liked it. A good coffee maker, one of those that makes real coffee. A plant that Estefania gave me one afternoon, saying that every place needs something alive. Some books I had wanted to read for years and never had time. A warm light lamp that made the nights feel cozy instead of empty. Small things, but completely mine. And Estefania was still there, not in a way that invaded that new space I was building, but in a way that complemented it. She understood, because she had lived it too, that rebuilding requires having your own territory, that the love that is born after the damage needs air, not walls. And we grew closer with that shared awareness, without haste, without the need to define everything before living it. There was one night when we went out to dinner, just the two of us, to a restaurant neither of us had been to before. It wasn't an expensive place. It was one of those small places with wooden tables and dim lighting and a menu that changes depending on what's fresh that day. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, about the things we had learned from our broken lives, about what we wanted for the years to come, about the fears we still carried and no longer pretended not to have. And at some point that night, while she was talking about something I don't remember exactly, I realized that I was completely present, not thinking about work, not calculating pending tasks, not carrying the weight of any guilt or any obligation, just there at that table, listening to that woman who made me feel that existing was something more than producing and supporting. That was what Aurora never knew how to give me. Not because she was a bad person, but because I didn't know how to ask for it either, because neither of us knew how to build that between us before it was too late. But with Estefania, it was different, and I knew it. I knew it with a quiet certainty, without urgency or euphoria, which was exactly the kind of certainty one can trust. What I didn't know yet was that things in the house I had left behind were about to get much more complicated, and that very soon the people who had abandoned me would appear at my door again. But this time I was no longer the same man they had known. It was on a Thursday morning when I received the unexpected call. It wasn't Julieta, it wasn't Jonathan, it was a number I hadn't saved, but I recognized it immediately when the voice spoke on the other end. It was Aurora, directly, without lawyers in between, without intermediaries, just her, with a voice that sounded different from the one I remembered, more subdued, smaller, as if someone had taken something from her that used to make her sound self-assured. She told me she needed to talk to me, that it wasn't about the legal process, that it was something personal. I told her she had 5 minutes and that I was listening. There was a long pause before she started to speak, and when she did, what she told me was not what I would have expected in any scenario I had imagined during those months. She told me she had made a mistake, in those exact words, that she had made a mistake and she knew it, that the relationship with that other man had turned out to be something completely different from what she had believed it was, that she had realized she had destroyed a real life for something that turned out to be an illusion, and that although she didn't expect me to forgive her or for things to go back to the way they were, she needed to tell me. I listened to everything without interrupting, and when she finished, I replied with the same cold calm I had learned to use in moments that demanded clarity over emotion. I told her I appreciated her telling me, that it was brave to admit a mistake of that magnitude, but that her regret, although I received it with respect, didn't change anything about what had happened or the decisions I had made since then, that my life had moved on. That I had moved on and that there was no way back to what we had been, not because I said it with anger, but because that path simply no longer existed. Aurora said nothing for several seconds. Then she asked me if there was someone else in my life. I had no obligation to answer that legally, morally, in any sense I had to give her that information. But I replied yes, that I had met someone, that I was happy, and that this happiness was not a response to what she had done to me, but the result of having chosen to build something new instead of remaining destroyed among the rubble of the old. Another long pause, and then Aurora hung up. I didn't hear from her directly for several weeks after that call, but the news kept coming through the usual indirect channels, and what came confirmed that her situation had worsened in ways I would never have consciously wished for her, but that I also couldn't pretend to be surprised by. The man for whom Aurora had destroyed our marriage turned out to be exactly the kind of person who is charming when he has no responsibilities and completely different when he does. When the novelty of the secret romance wore off and the relationship became something everyday, characteristics began to appear that the disguise of a passionate lover had hidden for months. He was irresponsible with money. He was emotionally unstable. He had a way of treating people when he was under pressure that had nothing to do with the man Aurora had thought she knew. And Aurora, who had left a life of 25 years of financial stability for that relationship, began to face practical consequences that hit hard. The house was still in legal proceedings, and the day-to-day expenses fell on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Because for 25 years, I had been the one who supported everything, and she had never had to worry about the financial details I handled in silence. Now, those details were her responsibility, and without the safety net I had represented for decades, reality felt different. I didn't know it from her. I knew it from Julieta, who in one of our conversations, without meaning to be a messenger, but unable to avoid the concern she felt for her mother, told me that things at home were not well, that Aurora was stressed, that the atmosphere was tense, that Julieta herself had thought about moving out because the situation had become difficult to sustain. I told Julieta that if she needed anything, that if she personally needed support, I was available, but that Aurora's problems were Aurora's, that I couldn't and didn't want to be the solution to the consequences of the decisions she herself had made. Julieta understood, and at that moment I noticed something that moved me more than I expected. My daughter had matured. The conversation we were having was not the conversation of a daughter who takes her mother's side and speaks to the father on her behalf. It was the conversation of a young woman who was learning to separate the bonds, to love both people without asking either one to solve the other's problems. She had grown in those months, and I, despite all the pain, felt something like pride. With Jonathan, the situation was more complicated. Jonathan had taken a side so definitively that night in the living room that the way back was longer and more difficult than Julieta's. Not because I made it more difficult for him, but because he himself seemed not to know how to walk it. Every time there was some kind of contact, whether for the legal process or for a specific matter, Jonathan had that attitude of someone who knows he made a mistake, but who still hasn't found a way to say it without it costing his pride too much. I knew him well. It was a trait that went way back. Jonathan had always had difficulty admitting mistakes since he was a child, not out of malice, but out of a kind of internal rigidity that made him interpret any acknowledgement of failure as a personal defeat. I had contributed to that without knowing it, with my own example of a man who solves everything in silence and never shows vulnerability. I had unintentionally taught him that men don't bend, and now he didn't know how to bend even if he wanted to. It wasn't on my list of priorities to solve that for him. I had my own things to think about. And in those days, one of the most important was a conversation I had had with Estefania, which had changed something in the way I saw the future. We were in the park, on our bench, on one of those afternoons when the sky has that particular color of when the day hasn't yet decided whether it will end in rain or calm. And Estefania asked me something no one had asked me in a long time. She asked me what I wanted, not what I needed, not what was responsible to do, but what I wanted. For myself, for the years to come. I was silent for a long moment, and I realized I didn't have a ready answer, that for 25 years I had always answered that question in terms of others. I wanted my children to have an education. I wanted Aurora to be comfortable. I wanted the house to be paid off, for the debts to be up to date, for the family to have stability. Everything I had wanted had been in relation to something or someone external to me. What did I want for myself? I didn't know. Estefania didn't pressure me. She just stayed there in silence, with that way of hers of giving space without abandoning. And I was several minutes without saying anything, looking at the still water of the artificial lake, letting the question do its work inside me. When I finally spoke, what came out was not an ordered list of goals. It was something simpler and more honest than that. I told her I wanted to wake up every morning without feeling that the day was a burden. That I wanted to work on something that mattered to me without the work consuming me whole. That I wanted to have people close to me who were there because they wanted to be, not because they needed something from me, that I wanted to laugh more, that I wanted to keep walking through places I didn't know, that I wanted at some point to feel that I was living my life instead of just managing it. Estefania listened to me and then said something that stuck with me with a precision that still surprises me today. She told me that everything I had just described was completely possible, that it wasn't an impossible dream or a fantasy of someone who refuses to see reality. It was simply a life, a real life built with conscious choices, and that the only difference between the person who dreams it and the person who lives it is that the second one decides to start before feeling ready. To decide before feeling ready. That phrase settled in me like things that arrive at the exact moment you need them. Not with noise, with roots. And I began to understand that what I had lost that night when I left with a suitcase hadn't been my life. It had been a version of my life that no longer corresponded to me. A version built on unrecognized sacrifices, on unrequited love in the way I needed, on an identity that existed for others and not for me. What I had now, although it was smaller in size, was incomparably more mine. And that, I discovered, was worth more than any house, than any apparent stability, than any version of life that is sustained only because no one has had the courage to tell the truth. I had had that courage, although I hadn't chosen it, although it had been forced upon me. And now, standing in that new place, with Estefania by my side and Hector on the horizon, and Julieta trying to build something honest with me, I felt something I hadn't recognized in myself for months. I felt that the future existed, but what was about to happen was going to test everything I had built. Because some people, when they lose what they don't learn, they just look to recover what they lost, and they were about to look for it in me. It was on a Saturday morning when Jonathan appeared at the door of my apartment. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't sent a message before. He hadn't called to ask if he could come. He just appeared in his own way of moving through the world, as if other people's spaces were a natural extension of his own. I saw him through the peephole before I opened the door, and I felt something that wasn't exactly surprise, but rather a confirmation of something I had been expecting without knowing when it would arrive. I opened the door. He looked at me for a second before speaking, as if he were evaluating something, as if the way I opened that door would tell him more than any words could. And what he saw was not what he expected. I'm sure of that, because the man standing in front of him was not the man who had left the family home with his shoulders heavy and his life in pieces. He was a rested man, a man who had slept well, a man who had freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen and plans for the afternoon that didn't include anyone asking him for something. I invited him in. He sat in the living room and looked around with an expression he couldn't quite hide. I think he expected to find something different, something sadder, more precarious, more in line with the image of a broken man that his imagination had probably built over these months. Instead, he found a small but tidy apartment with a plant in the window, books on the shelf, a warm light lamp, and the smell of coffee that filled the air in a way that made it feel like someone really lived there. Not survived, lived. I served him coffee without asking if he wanted any, because it was morning and it was the right thing to do, and because I wanted to give him something with my hands so that the initial silence wouldn't be too heavy. He took it, held it with both hands, and was silent for a long moment, looking at the cup. He finally spoke. He told me things were difficult. He didn't say it in those exact words. Jonathan was never that direct when he talked about something that made him uncomfortable, but with roundabout phrases and incomplete sentences that I pieced together as I listened. The financial situation at home had changed a lot since I left. The expenses I had covered for years were now a burden that no one was handling well. Aurora was stressed, and that created constant tension. The relationship with the other man had worsened to the point where he was barely at the house anymore, which meant the expenses fell completely on Aurora. And Jonathan, who had been living at the family home because it was comfortable and economical, was beginning to feel that that comfort was running out. I listened to it all, and as I listened, I noticed something that produced a strange mix of sadness and clarity in me. Jonathan hadn't come to apologize. He had come to see if I could somehow be a solution to the problems that his own misplaced loyalty had helped create. He didn't say it in those words. He probably didn't even think it with that clarity, but it was there in the way he avoided the real issue, in the way he described the situation always from the outside, as if it were someone else's problem and not something in which he had played an active role. When he finished speaking, I paused for a long time before answering. I told him I heard him, that I understood the situation was difficult, and then I asked him the same question I had asked him months ago on that phone call, but this time in person, looking him in the eyes. I asked him if he had come to talk about us, about what had happened between us as father and son, or if he had come because he needed something practical from me. Jonathan looked down, and that told me everything. I didn't get angry. Seriously, I didn't get angry because I had reached a point in these months where the anger towards the people who had failed me had been transforming into something different, not indifference. Exactly. Because total indifference towards your children is not something one can or should achieve, but a kind of compassionate lucidity. I could see them clearly, see their limitations, see the mechanisms they use to avoid having to face themselves, and at the same time continue to love them without letting that love turn me into their safety net every time their own decisions led them to an uncomfortable place. I told Jonathan something I had been thinking for a long time, and that at that moment I felt was the right time to say. I told him I loved him, that he was my son, and that didn't change, but that the kind of relationship we had before, where I was the one who supported everything and he was the one who received without questioning too much, that relationship was over. Not as a punishment, but because it was no longer possible or healthy for either of us, that if he wanted to build something new with me, something real and honest, I was willing, but that he would have to start by telling me the truth, not about the financial situation. but about what had happened that night in the living room and about how he felt about it. Jonathan squeezed the coffee cup. There was a silence that lasted for almost a full minute. A dense silence, full of unsaid things, of pride battling with something deeper than pride. And then, in a voice that sounded different from all the voices I had heard from him during that visit, lower, more real, he told me he knew he had been wrong, that night he had taken sides without thinking about what it really meant, that he had believed that supporting his mother was the right thing to do, and that only later, with time and distance, had he begun to see the whole picture, that it was hard for him to admit it, because admitting it meant accepting that he had hurt his father, and that was something he didn't know how to live with. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't have all the elements one would expect in a complete apology, but it was real, and reality, even if incomplete, is worth more than manufactured perfection. I told him I heard him, that I received it, and that it was a beginning. I didn't offer him financial solutions. I didn't tell him everything was fine or that he could count on me to solve the problems at home, because that would have been going back to the old pattern, the pattern in which I solve and others receive without consequences. That pattern had ended that night when I closed the door and didn't look back. Jonathan left an hour later without the practical answers he had probably expected to find, but with something that was perhaps worth more, even if he couldn't see it that way at the time. With his father's truth, with clear boundaries that came from love and not from resentment, with the certainty that I was still there, but different, more honest, more firm, more complete. I closed the door after he left and stood for a moment in the living room in silence. And then I went to the kitchen, poured myself another coffee, and called Estefania. I told her what had happened. She listened as always, without interrupting, without judging, without giving me more advice than I'd asked for. And when I finished, she asked me how I felt, not how I was, but how I felt. That distinction, small for some, for me was huge, because all my life people had asked me how I was, and I had always answered fine, even if it wasn't true. No one had asked me how I felt with the real expectation of receiving an honest answer. I told her I felt calm, that it was strange to say that after such a loaded conversation with my son, but that it was true, that I felt calm because I had responded from a place that was truly mine, not from fear, nor from guilt, nor from the need for him to approve of me or love me in a certain way. I had spoken as the man I wanted to be, and that, I discovered, produces a peace that no external approval can give you. Estefania smiled on the other end of the phone. I knew it even though I couldn't see her. There are people whose smile you can hear. She told me she had something to tell me too, that she had spoken with her boss that week about a new project they wanted her to participate in, something bigger than what she had done so far, with more responsibility, but also with more creative freedom. And that in thinking about whether to accept it or not, she had thought of me, not because she needed my permission or my opinion, but because she had thought of what I had said that night at the restaurant about wanting to live life instead of managing it. And she had decided yes, that she was going to accept. I was happy for her, with a joy that was completely clean, without envy, without fear that her growth would mean she would grow away, just pure joy for someone who chose to expand instead of shrink. That was new for me too. Wanting someone's good unconditionally, without calculating what was in it for me, without the secret fear that if the other person blossomed, I would be left in the background. That fear had been in me for years without me recognizing it, and now it was gone. We arranged to meet that afternoon. I hung up the phone, finished my coffee, and looked out the window of my small apartment to the street below. It was an ordinary morning, people walking, a dog pulling on its leash, a child on a bicycle with training wheels who was still wobbly, but not falling. And I thought that was exactly it, still wobbly at times, but not falling, moving forward. 3 more months passed before the situation reached the point that I deep down knew it would. It wasn't a surprise. It was more like a confirmation of something I had seen coming from a long way off, with that clarity you develop when you're no longer the center of the chaos and you start observing it from the outside. When you stop being the one who puts out the fires, you start to see much more clearly how they start. And what had been brewing in the house I had left behind was not a small fire. It was something that had been accumulating fuel for months and that finally found the spark it needed to ignite completely. I first found out from Julieta. She called me on a Wednesday night with a voice I recognized immediately as the voice of someone who has been holding something back for too long and can no longer contain it. She told me she had left the house, that she had taken her things and had gone to live with a friend while she found something more stable, that the situation with her mother had reached a point she could no longer sustain emotionally, that Aurora and the other man had broken up for good, that he had left taking things that weren't his, that he had left debts Aurora didn't know how to handle, and that the atmosphere in the house was a mix of anguish, contained anger and heavy silence that made it impossible to live there with any kind of peace. I listened to everything without interrupting. I asked her how she was. No, the situation. Julieta, was silent for a moment before answering and then said something that hit me deep inside. She told me she was learning, that she had made big mistakes, that she knew she had failed me, that she still carried that, but that she was also learning not to repeat the same patterns, that seeing what had happened to her mother, seeing how a decision made from emotion without thinking about the consequences could tear a life apart. It had taught her something that no class or any book could have taught her. It had taught her that actions have real weight, that the weight doesn't disappear because you decide to ignore it. I told her I was proud of her for saying that, and I meant it. I asked her if she needed financial help for the first month in the new place. Not because it was my obligation or because I wanted to buy her affection, but because she was my daughter and she was starting something difficult, and I had the ability to help without it costing me more than I could give. She hesitated before accepting. That hesitation told me more about her growth than any words could. The Julieta of before would not have hesitated. She would have accepted naturally, as if it were expected. This Julieta hesitated because she understood that receiving has a weight too. She accepted. I transferred $500 to her that same night. Not with conditions, not with a speech, just the money and a short message saying it was a start and she could count on me for whatever she needed within reason. With Jonathan, the situation unfolded differently. Unlike Julieta, Jonathan didn't leave the house immediately. He stayed longer, I think because deep down he hoped something would change, that the situation would stabilize on its own, that someone would appear to solve what no one wanted to solve. But when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, that Aurora was overwhelmed and that the house I had paid for 25 years was now a territory of constant tension, Jonathan also began to look for ways out. The difference is that Jonathan looked for his way out through me. He called me one afternoon, and this time it was different from the Saturday visit months ago. This time there were no long roundabout phrases or incomplete sentences. He asked me directly if he could stay at my apartment while he found his own place. He told me it would be temporary, that he already had some options he was exploring, but that he needed a few weeks to get organized. I took a deep breath before answering, and I said no. Not cruelly, not with an emotional slam of the door, but with the same quiet clarity I had been developing over these months, as if it were a muscle that gets stronger with use. I told him I loved him, and that didn't change, but that my apartment was my space, the only completely my own space I'd had in decades, and that I was not willing to give it up even partially or temporarily. Because temporary things often become permanent when no one sets a clear limit from the beginning. I told him I could help him in other ways, that I could guide him in his search for a place to rent, that I could help him review contracts if he needed a second opinion, that if there was a real and specific emergency, I could consider a small financial support for the initial deposit. But that living together was not an option. Jonathan was silent for a moment and then asked me why, in a voice that had a hint of genuine incomprehension, as if he couldn't fully understand his father telling him no. I explained. I told him that for 25 years I had organized my entire life around the needs of others, that it hadn't been forced, that I had chosen it because I believed it was the right thing to do and because no one had taught me another way to show love, but that the result of that way of living had been that I had lost myself in the process. That I had reached the age of 49 without knowing what I wanted for myself, without my own space, without an identity that existed independently of what I produced and supported for others, and that now that I had that space, that small apartment with its plant and its books and its warm light lamp, I was not going to give it up. Not for anyone. It was the most honest conversation Jonathan and I had ever had in his entire adult life. When I hung up, I sat on the couch for a long time, processing everything, and I realized that saying no, saying it clearly and without guilt, was a skill I had taken almost 50 years to develop, and that now that I had it, I wasn't going to let it go. That same week, I had another important conversation, this time with Hector. We met for dinner, something we had started doing every 2 weeks as a routine that neither of us had consciously planned, but that had established itself on its own. Hector was like that. Good things with Hector always establish themselves on their own, without drama, without needing to be named to exist. I told him everything that had happened with Jonathan and Julieta. He listened with that focused attention of his that doesn't get distracted and doesn't interrupt. And when I finished, he said something that made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in a long time. One of those laughs that comes from recognizing an uncomfortable truth you already knew, but needed to hear said by someone else. He told me I had gone from being the tree everyone used for shade to a tree that had finally learned to grow upwards instead of just spreading outwards, and that those who used to sit in my shade now had to learn to find their own sun. I don't know if it was a perfect metaphor, but it was true. That night, on my way back to the apartment, I found a message from Estefania asking if I wanted to accompany her the next day to see an antique market that had been set up in a park on the other side of the city. It wasn't an extraordinary plan. It was a Saturday morning among stalls of old things and coffee in a cardboard cup and conversations with no fixed destination. I replied yes immediately. And as I was getting ready for bed, as I was turning off the warm light lamp and listening to the quiet silence of my apartment, I thought about everything that had changed in less than a year. I had left the house with a suitcase and a broken heart. I had slept on a friend's couch. I had cried alone in the dark. I had learned to walk aimlessly and to sit without guilt and to say no without apologizing for it. I had met a woman who asked me how I felt and really expected an answer. I had gotten my daughter back, not the idealized version that pain had stored in my memory, but the real, imperfect, and growing version, which was much more valuable than any idealization. I had started to rebuild something with my son, slowly, without guarantees, but from an honest place. And I had learned perhaps the hardest thing of all, that self-love is not selfishness, that taking care of yourself is not abandoning others, that setting boundaries is not coldness. It's the only way to remain someone capable of giving without emptying yourself. What I didn't know yet was that there was one more chapter, one I hadn't anticipated, one that would come from the least expected direction, and that would put everything I had built to the most difficult test I had faced since that afternoon when I opened the door of my house and found the three of them sitting in silence waiting for me. But this time I was ready. Aurora called me on a Sunday morning. It wasn't the first time she had done so since that call months ago when she had told me she had made a mistake, but there was something different in her tone this time, something that wasn't the subdued, small voice of that first call, nor the tense, calculated voice I had known for 25 years. It was a voice that sounded for the first time in a long time, completely stripped of all strategy, like someone who has exhausted all masks and is calling from a place where they no longer have the energy to keep pretending. She told me she needed to see me. I asked her what for. She told me there were things she needed to tell me in person, that it wasn't about the legal process, that was almost resolved between the lawyers, that it was something personal, that she owed it to me, that she owed it to herself too. I was silent for a moment before answering. A part of me, the part that had learned to protect itself in these months, wanted to say no, that we had already said everything there was to say, that the chapter was closed, and that opening it again would bring no good to either of us. But there was another part, deeper and older, that understood that some conversations need to happen, even if they don't change anything practical, that there are words people need to say and hear to be able to truly close something, not to go back, but to let go. I said yes, that we could meet in a public, neutral place without the emotional burden of any space that belonged to either of us. We agreed on a cafe near the center, a place neither of us had frequented before, a no-man's land where difficult conversations could happen without the weight of memory stuck to the walls. I arrived first, sat at a table by the window, and ordered a black coffee while I waited. I looked out at the street for a few minutes and noticed that I was calm, Not anxious, not full of anticipated anger or prepared sadness. Calm, and it seemed extraordinary to me, in the most literal sense of the word, that I could sit and wait for the woman who had destroyed my marriage and feel simply calm. Aurora arrived on time. I saw her enter from the window before she saw me, and what I saw stopped me for a second. Not because it produced what it would have produced before. There was no trace of that old love or that recent anger, but because I saw a person who had aged in a way that had nothing to do with years, but with weight. There was something in the way she carried her shoulders, in the line of her jaw, in the way she searched with her eyes among the tables, that said that this woman had lived through something difficult and that she was still carrying it. She saw me, walked to the table, sat down. We looked at each other for a moment without saying anything. Then she spoke. What she told me over the next 40 minutes, I'm not going to reproduce word for word, because some conversations belong only to the people who had them. But I will say the essential. She told me she had had time, too much time, to see herself honestly, that what she had done hadn't been just an error of judgment or a decision made in a moment of weakness. It had been the result of years of not talking, of not asking for what she needed, of convincing herself that the dissatisfaction she felt was my fault when in reality it was a conversation we had never had together. That instead of talking, she had looked outside for what she should have looked for inside. First in herself, and then in our relationship, that she had involved the children in a way that had no justification, that she had made Jonathan and Julieta carry something that was the responsibility of adults and not of children, and that all of that together was something she would have to live with for a long time. She wasn't crying while she said all that, and that told me more than if she had cried. Tears are sometimes relief. What she had on her face was not relief. It was the serious and unadorned expression of someone who is looking at their own mistakes without asking anyone to minimize them. When she finished, she asked if she could tell me something. Not if I forgave her, not if we could try again, just if she could tell me something. I thought before speaking, and I told her the truth. I told her that I hadn't been the man she needed for many years either, that I had believed that providing was enough, and that that belief had cost us both dearly. That if I had known how to listen better, if I had been more present, if I had learned earlier that love is not shown only with work and money, but also with attention and with time, maybe things would have been different. I wasn't excusing what she had done. I was acknowledging that broken stories rarely have a single culprit. I also told her that I forgave her, not because what she had done was right, but because carrying the weight of not forgiving was too heavy a job for the rest of my life, and I had decided to travel light, that the forgiveness was not for her, it was for me, so I could keep walking without that weight on my back. Aurora looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then said, "Thank you," just that. "Thank you." We said goodbye at the door of the cafe with the right distance, without the forced hug of people who no longer know how to touch each other, nor the unnecessary coldness of people who need to show that they no longer care about anything. Just two people who had shared 25 years of life, and who were now saying goodbye from a place of truth. I watched her walk away down the street, and I felt nothing pulling me back. I just felt that something that had been open for months was finally closing. Not with a bang, with the softness of a door that someone closes carefully because they know that on the other side there is something that deserves silence. I walked back to the apartment with my hands in my pockets and the morning sun on my face. That afternoon, Estefania came over. We had planned to cook together, something we had started doing on Sundays, as one of those small routines that build real life without you noticing until they are already part of who you are. She brought the ingredients, I put on the music, and we cooked in that narrow kitchen that barely had space for two people moving at the same time, bumping elbows, laughing at the culinary accidents. Talking about everything and nothing with the comfort of two people who no longer have to try to be well together. I told her about the meeting with Aurora while we were chopping onions, without drama, with the same naturalness with which I told her anything about my day. Estefania listened, and when I finished, she asked me how I felt. As always, that question she never got tired of asking. I told her I felt free, that it was the first time I had used that word to describe how I was, and that I meant it free, not in the sense that there were no responsibilities or ties. but free in the sense that everything in my life was there because I had chosen it. The job, the apartment, the plant in the window, the books on the shelf, Hector, Julieta, the relationship I was slowly rebuilding with Jonathan and her, all chosen. Nothing endured. As Stefania put the knife down on the cutting board, looked at me, and said something I didn't expect to hear at that moment, but that landed exactly where it needed to. She told me that months ago, the first time we had seen each other in the park, she had noticed something in me that she had found different from most of the men she had met after her own difficult story. It wasn't that I was perfect or that I didn't have visible wounds. It was that despite the wounds, I wasn't closed off, that there was something in the way I sat on that bench and looked at the water that said I was a person who was still willing to be in the world, and that in someone who had been through what I had been through. It was something you didn't find every day. I didn't know what to answer for a moment. Then I told her that she had taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn, that you could be well without needing everything to be resolved, that happiness wasn't the state that arrived when all the problems disappeared. It was the decision to be present while the problems still existed and life kept moving. We finished cooking, set the table, opened a bottle of simple wine, and sat down to eat in that small kitchen with music in the background and the afternoon light coming through the window, as if the world outside was exactly as calm as it felt inside. I thought of the man who had walked through that door almost a year ago and had found his family sitting in silence waiting for him with a decision already made. I thought of the suitcase I had packed with a calm I didn't understand. I thought of the dark parking lot, of Hector's couch, of the morning walks, of the nights when my chest would tighten without warning. I thought of the park bench and of a woman who had looked up from her book and said there was enough space for both of us, and I thought that sometimes life needs to break completely to reveal what it was always meant to be. I hadn't gained anything by taking it from anyone. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't waited for others to fall to feel good. I had simply chosen to go on, chosen to build, chosen to be present in my own life for the first time in decades. That was all, and it was enough, more than enough. I raised my glass and toasted in silence, without his Stefania noticing, without a speech or ceremony. Just me and the wine and the life I had chosen to live. To the man who left that house without looking back. To the man who learned that letting go is not losing. To the man who discovered at almost 50 that he was still in time to be truly happy.